So let's try again. So okay, Primoz, you let me know when you've started recording.
We're recording.
Okay, good. So as already mentioned, today we'll be covering two prefaces. One that was written in 1928 and the other one which was written in 1965, so one of the later editions of the book. Before we begin, maybe I would just like to say what the main point is of actually having a special session dedicated to the two prefaces. As mentioned last time, Plessner's work is basically as a spider web of sorts. So there's so many cross-references, there's so many links to other authors, to other thinkers, and it's really important to embed his text into the overall background in which he was working, so as to gain a better understanding of what he's actually doing or what he's trying to do. And trying to understand the main points that he's making that he makes in prefaces is very useful, so as to know where he's heading. And this is something that often gets forgotten when you read the text. When he has many of his meanderings, you kind of lose the overarching idea that he's trying to develop. So these prefaces can be very useful in that regard. So here is an itinerary of my short presentation. So I will say a few words about the book, then what his inspiration and aim is or were, and the influences, the three main influences that he portrays or mentions or investigates, especially in the second preface. Okay, so first, a few words about the book. The book was actually finished already in 1926, but was then published in 1928. And as Plessner puts it, the book is a continuation of his two previous works. One is the so-called Unity of Senses, the Einheit der Sinne, from 1923, and the other one is the Limits of Community, Grenzen der Gemeinschaft, from 1924. The Unity of the Senses is the more important one of the two, and he refers to it in later chapters as well, especially in the first chapter. We'll be saying more on that particular work then. Plessner says that the book itself was not particularly well received, and that for the most part it was ignored, or as he himself puts it, the levels has not been subjected to serious criticism. And he provides several reasons for this. The first reason is a larger socio-political reason, namely with the rise of National Socialism, what happened was a large-scale inhibition of discussion. So from 1933, basically, all public discussion was, for the most part, subdued. But there were other reasons as well. So we still had.
Sorry, yeah? Is it okay if we interrupt you, or do you rather just talk and then we discuss? If we have,
we can do it both ways, but maybe if we have like a separate discussion on this later on. Unless it's something that it's either factually sketchy or something like that.
Well, I mean, just my ignorance of Plessner. So you're saying 33 might have been in, what happened with the rise to power of the Nazi party might have influenced the how much this book was read and discussed. Was Plessner Jewish?
Yeah, his father was of Jewish descent, so yeah, that's the reason also why he had to flee later on to the Netherlands and so on and so forth. Yeah. And but in general, even despite this, like the more multi-layered discussion somehow was canceled during this time. Okay, but there were other reasons, because still there were 5 years between 1928 and 1933. So between the publication of the book and the rise of the National Socialists. And the reasons here were as follows. First, in 1928, so in the same year, Scheler, Max Scheler, published his book, The Human Place in Nature, or in Cosmos. That's the more literal translation. So Die Stellung des Menschen im Kosmos, which was quite influential. Scheler was a very popular author at that point, and we'll say a bit more on Scheler later on. And the problem was that many people thought of levels simply as an explication of Scheler's work. So they thought that Plessner was a student of Scheler's and that he was basically explicating some of the ideas that Scheler was unable to fully develop in his work. Even more importantly, 1 year prior to that, Heidegger published Being and Time. And this was a huge event with the capital E. So, you know, Heidegger basically, in a certain sense, revolutionized the philosophical atmosphere, the philosophical sphere, and he brought novelty, freshness, and opened up new vistas for productive investigations and productive research. So Heidegger's work basically overshadowed many of the books that were published during this time, and so this particular book was probably the reason why many of the books, Plessner's included, weren't studied as carefully as they probably would have been deserved to be studied. And then finally, one of the reasons was the book itself. In a certain sense, Plessner committed a noetic sacrilegious act. So he dared to ask a forbidden question. Or as he himself puts it, somebody had dared to treat biological subjects in a philosophical manner. And this was apparently a heresy for many. He continues, a philosophy of the organic, the times of Driesch were over. The question of vitalism had lost its currency, just as the idea of producing living processes in a test tube had lost its terror. And Plessner says in his second preface that the developments in the fields of biochemistry, theoretical chemistry, the emergence of neo-Darwinism and cybernetics, all these disciplines, all these developments have kind of cast a pretty dire shadow on the project that Plessner was trying to do in his book. Okay, so this leads us already to the second part of the presentation. So the main inspiration for the book can be traced back to Plessner's student's years. So when he was a student of zoology, what he noticed was a profound tension between natural sciences and philosophy. And this is from the first preface and from the very beginning of the first preface. And here you have a really good example of what I was saying before. So he just name drops, you know, he just drops 6 different names on you. And he expects that you will know who he is referring to. And of course, most readers have no idea who these people are. But apparently all these people were actually his teachers at one point. So he mentions Otto Büchli, who apparently was a pretty famous physiologist back then, and Kurt Herbst, he was a physiologist and embryologist. Maybe Dan knows more about these people, and he can maybe comment later on. Then Wilhelm Windelband and Emil Lask were 2 very prominent neo-Kantian philosophers. Ernst Troeltsch was a theologian and also a philosopher and theoretician of history, if I'm not mistaken. And then there's Hans Driesch, the notorious biologist / philosopher, the famous or infamous neo-vitalist who was causing quite a lot of stir during those times. And apparently he had great influence on Plessner, which will become more apparent in later chapters. So the general project or the general idea behind the book is to find a way to bring these two seemingly separate fields, philosophy and natural sciences, together. Plessner says the following: as someone who did not want to sacrifice the one to the other, these tensions impelled me to reflect on new possibilities of understanding nature from a philosophical perspective, in a way that would be as able to withstand the severe criticism brought by the philosophy of the time, as it would be receptive of the impulses coming in particular from the new biology of Driesch and von Uexküll. So he would like to the idea is to develop a new way of looking at nature that would both be accommodating to what some of the biologists of the time were doing, and he names Driesch here and Jakob von Uexküll, and that would also be able to defend itself against the critiques of some of the philosophers of the time. Here he's referring primarily to, I would say, neo-Kantians and also to a certain degree the Lebensphilosophen, so life philosophers. We will say more on them in our during our next meeting. So the idea is to develop a philosophical biology and anthropology. And he says that a part of this project was already done in his first book, The Unity of the Senses, but there he adopted a different approach. He calls this approach a horizontal approach. And again, this is something that we will say more on at our later meeting, at our next meeting. And what he means by this horizontal approach is finding and investigating ways in which a human being as a concrete unity is engaged with its world. So different levels of correlation between the human person on a concrete level and the world he or she lives in. Apparently he proposed several of these levels of correlation, and also tried to find certain a priori laws of these correlations. So Plessner also emphasizes the importance of recent revolutions that have happened in the field of psychology, sociology, biology, and especially philosophical methodology during those times. But he says that one should not overlook the originality of his own conception, of his own approach. And he mentions several authors that were influential, so that kind of helped him in developing the ideas that he presents in this particular book. I will just mention three of them: Max Scheler, Martin Heidegger, and Arnold Gehlen. Although he mentioned several others, Dilthey being a very important one, and more will be said on him again next time. Misch, who was one of the most well-known students of Dilthey, Uexküll, Windelband, and so on and so forth. So again, I will just focus on the first three because he devotes most of his time in the especially second preface to these authors. So Max Scheler was a very interesting figure. He was he could be classified as a phenomenologist, but a phenomenologist who at a certain point moved away from Husserl. So he did not want to follow Husserl in his transcendental turn. So when Husserl went in the direction of transcendental idealism, Scheler and several other Husserl students decided that this is not the path that they want to pursue. So Scheler was influenced by Husserl's overall approach, by the phenomenological method. He believed that there is a certain freshness that can be gained if one pursues this particular methodology. But again, he did not want to take the transcendentalist turn. And this is something that resonates well with Plessner, because as we will see, he also thinks that phenomenological method is a very useful tool in the philosophical arsenal. And again, and also he's also very critical of Husserl's later later ideas. Then the second thing why Scheler is important for Plessner is because Scheler emphasizes the cognitive importance of emotions. So he somehow broadens the conception of mindedness. So he broadens the notion of what it means to be cognitive. So emotions all of a sudden are not merely epiphenomena of cognitive processes, but have a certain cognitive import in and of their on their own. And this is something that is extremely important for Plessner, and this is also something that was very important for Heidegger, for instance. So Scheler was also a big influence on Heidegger. The third point that is really important for Plessner, as we will see, is this idea that human should be understood as a transition and transcendence. What is meant by this is that a human being must not be understood as a thing, as a self-enclosed entity, but something that is more akin to becoming. So something that is closer to becoming than to a thing. It is what is characteristic for the human level is precisely this capacity of self-transcendence, to become something else, to go beyond yourself, to be an ecstatic being, so a being that stands outside of itself. And the last point that is really important for Plessner here is Scheler's understanding of human as being open to the world. So this notion of world openness. So according to Scheler, what happens at the level of the human organization is that drives become displaced. So the human being is no longer determined by certain discrete predetermined drives, but has the ability to say no. So this capacity that Plessner calls the surplus of negativity. So there is the capacity to negate, to break with something, to cultivate a certain hiatus. So not to be caught up in a certain milieu, in a certain environment, but the capacity to break out of this particular milieu or environment. So this ability to say no, this is something that will be very important for Plessner's own theory. Now, what are the main issues with Scheler's approach? First, well, in general, he says that Scheler remains bound to the phenomenological approach, and he does not want to elaborate on this further. So I'm not really sure what this means. We will be able to maybe get a glimpse of why this might be a problem for Plessner in some later chapters. And the second thing is that Scheler never actually developed a unified point. So he was never able to capture different layers of which he talks, or different levels of which he talks from a unified perspective. And Plessner does precisely this. In fact, Plessner even thinks that this is something that is very that Scheler would be averse to this approach, so that he would find it problematic that somebody would try to do something like that. So he believes that Scheler would take issues with what Plessner was trying to do. Okay, and then the second influence is Martin Heidegger. This is the way Plessner presents the relevance of Heidegger, or you know, how Heidegger was perceived at the time. The power and density of the ideas, the originality and dark tone of the language, the unwavering progression through its thematic structure, all immediately attracted attention. So as mentioned, Heidegger was an event with a capital E, and his work overshadowed many of the things that were developed at approximately the same time and even after that. So what does Heidegger bring to the table? One thing is the problem of historicity. So Heidegger, so these are again the things that are relevant for Plessner's own position. So in Heidegger's, from Heidegger's perspective, being human is actually something that is historically mutable. So Heidegger brings this historicity, temporality, and dynamism into our understanding of a human being. Again, there is no such thing as a human being that would be universal and unchangeable. It is something that develops through action, and through a specific way, human beings relate to their own being. So your attitude to your own existence, to your own being, will determine who you will become, what kind of a life you will live. So this is something that changes through time. So there's this historicity, or so historical temporal element to understanding of human existence. And then closely related to this is this notion of, so this idea that if we want to understand human beings, we have to use different categories than the ones that are used when we are talking about the objective world. So when we talk about things, we use certain categories, okay? And these were kind of entrenched in the Western canon. However, if we really want to capture the concrete human being, we need to develop a different set of notions, and these are the so-called existentials. So if we want to describe human being, we need a different set of notions. And he says that what is the characteristic for human being is that there is a potential, not something that, so that there isn't a certain something, but a potential. So a human has this openness for change. There's a certain openness for change, a certain dynamism, the capacity to become something else, the capacity to transcend what you are at this particular point. And this potentiality is something that that requires a different different ways of talking than the ones that you find when you talk about, again, things. And all this, so this talk about human existence, developing new ways of looking at human beings and talking about them, touched upon a certain neurologic point of the time, and that's the reason why Heidegger's approach was hugely popular. Plessner says that Heidegger's methodological atheism of destruction was even more popular than Scheler's theism, even though Scheler was extremely popular. Heidegger overshadowed the popularity of Scheler. What are the main issues of Heidegger's approach? Plessner basically points out one major flaw, one major difficulty, but he presents it from different angles. And the main point is that Heidegger's existential analysis loses the corporeality of human beings. Like this, what happens is that there is a loss of the notion of an embodied human that is embedded into a living world. So something that, for example, authors like Scheler were trying to develop, this is something that, according to Plessner, and here he follows the critique that I think Misch, I'm not sure about this, levels against Heidegger, but the main point is that this corporeal embodied dimension gets lost. At one point he says, the disembodied and genderless Dasein in Man cannot be primordial. So you cannot start from Dasein, yeah, from being there, because it's too abstract. And not only is it too abstract, it has certain idealistic undertones which Plessner dislikes. And he thinks, so Plessner thinks that Heidegger is correct, that he introduces moods, cares, fears, and so on and so forth into the picture, but he overlooks that these are actually modes of vitality. that these are actually modes of living beings, ways of aliveness, so to speak. And again, he does not anchor this into something more corporeal, something more somatically thick or dense. This is the way he phrases it. Only embodied beings can be in a mood or be afraid. Angels do not fear. Even animals are subject to moods and to fear. So this is what Heidegger overlooks, that these are the segments, the dimensions that anchor human beings into, you know, the realm of aliveness in general. Okay, the final figure is Arnold Gehlen. Arnold Gehlen is a useful counterpart to Heidegger. So because he approaches the question of the human from a different perspective. So he starts off from the scientific anthropology. So if Heidegger starts from a level that is somehow too abstract, Gehlen starts from a different position. So he starts from the empirical studies of the human being. And what Gehlen tries to do is he tries to find an overarching dimension of the human or humanity, because this is something he feels is lacking in the empirical studies of the human being. Okay, Gehlen is extremely important actually for Plessner. So Gehlen draws on Herder's notion of deficient being or Mängelwesen. So the idea here is that unlike animals, human beings are not determined by specific drives. And in that regard, they are deficient. They do not have already predetermined skills that would define who they are and in what kind of environment or milieu they would live in. And Gehlen says that what is characteristic of human beings is precisely their potential to act. They are, as he says, primarily active beings. And this is something that is very similar to Heidegger, as you see. So it's again, because the human being is a deficient being, it is through the actions, it is through the behavior that the human being constitutes him or herself. And such a being exhibits high plasticity. So according to Gehlen, what we notice in human beings is instinct relief. This is again something similar to what Scheler is talking about. So there are no predetermined instincts that would just allow you to run smoothly through the world you live in. The acquired motor skills become more important in human beings than the inherited ones. And these acquired motor skills are related to tools and speech. So the human being has the capacity to make tools, and one of the most important tools is language. Language is the tool that is crucial for the Mängelwesen, for the deficient being. Why is language so important? It is precisely because language allows this world openness that Scheler is talking about. What does that mean? Well, language, according to Gehlen, has a double aspect. In a certain sense, it is a relief for a human being. So a human being is a deficient being, and language is a tool that allows that particular being to construct specific symbolic worlds in which it can live. Okay, so it is something that provides a relief from this original state, undetermined, undefined state in which a human being finds itself. What does it mean that language opens up the world? It means that language brings into the picture the reciprocity of perspective. So if I'm able to understand speech, if I'm able to understand what, for instance, Dan is saying at a certain point, this means that I'm able to take on the perspective of Dan, and I'm no longer encapsulated in a very specific perspective. So for a human, for an animal, you always have a certain position in which, or a certain perspective from which that animal responds to the world. Language allows you to switch perspectives. So you can take on different perspectives on a certain situation. And this is what opens up the world. human beings have not only Umwelt or milieu, but the world, in the sense of precisely what I just said, that they have this reciprocity of perspective, which opens up a multi-perspectivity. Plessner puts this as follows: as separate as they may be, each is part of the other. However, that is only one aspect of language. So on the one hand, language provides relief, but on the other hand, it is also a burden. Why? Because every expression risks, with every expression comes a risk of misinterpretation. So if I utter something, I might be misunderstood. The perspective that the other thing takes is not necessarily the perspective that I'm trying to convey. So while on the one hand, language allows for the reciprocity of perspective, and this allows for a greater connectedness between the two people engaged in a discussion, it also creates a distance precisely because of this risk of misinterpretation. So Plessner phrases this extremely nicely. He says, expression conjures internalization, or Äußerung, which is expression, brings about Innerung, which is internalization. So it's a bit of a play on words there. But the idea is, it is precisely because of this possibility of being misunderstood that the idea of having an inner part of me emerges. So the internality, the subjectivity, so to speak, gets born through this particular process. So with the development of language, with the capacity of taking on different perspectives, and also with the capacity of misunderstanding the person saying something. So that's one element that gives rise to the development of internalization. But there's another one. He says that because of the instinct relief in human being, what we have are these bursts of feeling. So because there's no instinct that would determine how I am supposed to act in a given situation, there is a certain hiatus that opens in that particular moment, and I do not necessarily act, but what I do is there is this burst of feeling, which is some sort of a substitute for an overt action. So the emotional realm kind of opens up also as an important aspect of developing this this phenomenon of interiority, which is characteristic for human beings. So these two elements, speech and instinct relief, which is accompanied by a burst of feeling, they create the hiatus, the gap between the present excitation and the third action into which consciousness springs. Okay, now we're kind of moving to the last part of the presentation. According to Plessner, Gehlen does not go far enough. So in many regards, Gehlen improves on many of the flaws that, according to Plessner, can be found in Heidegger. So Gehlen, in a certain sense, integrates Scheler and Heidegger and adds his special something to the mix, but he does not go far enough. So the problem, according to Plessner, is that if at a certain point you construe a human being the way Gehlen does, you realize that if you really want to do a proper anthropology, a proper philosophical anthropology, you realize that you have to abandon all schematism. So all the schematic approaches, all the models of the human being, even the one that is provided by Gehlen, even that one is too restrictive for Plessner. So he will try to do something that is even more open, even more broad in its overall approach. So the first thing, by the way, these 3 points that I will be mentioning here, these are basically the 3 cornerstones of this book. And again, this is something that gets easily missed because there's so much nuance in the book itself. So first thing that Plessner will do is he will take up the idea of the openness of human being, this world openness that both Scheler, Heidegger, that Scheler, Heidegger, and Gehlen are talking about, and he will try to account for it or thematize it through the notion of eccentric positionality. So according to Plessner, human being is a being that is positioned in a world in a very specific way. Namely, the center of a human being is always decentered. So this capacity to switch, to modify, to alternate centers or perspectives is what is characteristic for the human being. And this is something that Plessner will call eccentric positionality. So that's one segment. This will be the last part of the book. However, he says that if we want to understand eccentric positionality, we first have to understand positionality. And positionality is something that is basically the general structure of vitality. So positionality is the fundamental characteristic of living beings in general. Living beings are positional beings. They are always positioned. They have a specific perspective, and he will explain what he means by this. And the main feature, so the main characteristic of positionality is boundedness. So having a boundary is what determines positionality. Having a boundary or boundedness is, according to Plessner, the minimal condition of being alive. So these three notions, boundedness, positionality, which is closely related to boundedness and emerges from boundedness, and then finally eccentric positionality, which is characteristic of human beings. And he says, and this is also very important, that in a certain broad sense of the term, he will be following a Kantian legacy. So he will be working within the tradition of intuitive philosophy, as he calls it. And that what he is trying to do, or what he will try to do in this particular book, is he will try to determine the so-called organic models. Organic models are basically a priori characteristics of the organic, or a priori characteristics of the vital. So these three features that we mentioned here, boundedness, positionality, and eccentric positionality, are, according to Plessner, organic models. So he is basically, in a certain sense, and in a very specific meaning of the word, trying to develop an a priori theory of the organic. So this is a brief intro into the book. I hope this was useful, and that it will serve as a nice map for the upcoming chapters. So yeah, any comments, questions on all of this?
Well, one thing I would be interested in hearing about maybe is what people think. What do people think this notion of the outer intuition is, which Plessner mentions, that he is going to use the viewpoint of the biologist, which is outer intuition. What does that entail exactly? If anyone had any thoughts, come up. What does it mean to study phenomena with the outer intuition of the biologist?
That's basically, if I understand him correctly, and then Matt, you can maybe expand on this, the Kantian distinction between outer and inner intuition. You know, outer intuition is basically something that is given in the perceptual world, and the inner intuition is basically something that is related to the interiority, so to speak. So what he will try to do is he will try to operate within the realms of the outer intuition. So he will always be focusing on the forms as they are given in our intuition. And this is basically a whole tradition of thinkers such as Scheler and the neo-Kantians that he mentions. They were kind of all trying to operate within this particular field. So one thing that he tries to say with this is that he does not want to fall into some sort of naive naturalism where he would say, I'm just now studying the structures of the world as they are in themselves. I am working in the field of the intuitive philosophy. So what I'm talking about are the intuitive forms that are given in my lived experience, in my experience, external experience, and I am trying to account for them. That's also why he's trying to develop the a priori theory of the organic. It's basically a Kantian project, but a very an extremely expanded Kantian project.
Yeah, I have a question. How it connects with Varela, or did Varela use Plessner as inspiration?
No, I don't think Varela knew about Plessner, but he knew about Merleau-Ponty, and Merleau-Ponty might have known about Plessner. But I think at the end of the first or the second preface, Plessner actually mentions having read Merleau-Ponty, who read as though he had read the levels before, but he kind of thought it was probably just a coincidence of similar thoughts converging.
I was actually looking up on that, and it would seem that Merleau-Ponty got in touch with Plessner's ideas through Buitendijk. So the guy I mentioned last time, that's the guy that was hosting Plessner in the Netherlands. He was Merleau-Ponty was acquainted with some of his works, and it would seem that this is the route through which he came in touch with Plessner's ideas. Oh,
do you remember Sebastian, in last semester where you had Andreas Weber talk about the genesis of the paper, of Varela's last paper, Life After Kant?
yeah.
He explained there that he was responsible for introducing Varela to a number of continental thinkers. He gave a list, and I don't remember if Plessner was one of them. Do you remember?
He mentioned him, and Plessner is actually mentioned in that last paper. So in the references, okay, he's mentioned there, but he's more like he's mentioned as one of those authors who could be potentially useful for this approach. So the approach that Varela and his colleagues are developing, but is so far an uncharted territory, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's actually interesting because in that paper they draw on Hans Jonas, but yeah, Hans Jonas, I think, drew on Plessner, but he never really. I think I read some paper, and I don't know where anymore, that kind of analyzed why Jonas so rarely mentioned Plessner. That was despite the kind of obvious depth he had towards Plessner in terms of his ideas.
I'm wondering, Sebastian, if you know much about the influence of, or the importance of the influence of Schelling on Plessner's thought, his desire to kind of inherit the transcendental tradition, but in some ways overcome the idealistic temptations, seems similar to what Schelling was up to with his philosophy of nature. And I know in the next chapter, he starts with this excerpt from a letter that Alexander von Humboldt wrote to Schelling. And he doesn't cite Schelling in the first or second chapter, at least, but it seems like he's in some ways recapitulating the two sort of directions one can take in philosophy that Schelling develops, the transcendental and the natural philosophical directions, and sort of plays them against each other. So just wondering what the significance of Schelling is for Plessner.
That's a good question, and maybe also Chris might know more about this. I can just say that I don't think that Plessner mentions Schelling at all in this book. So he mentions Fichte, he mentions Hegel in several places, and he's constantly debating the neo-Kantians of the time, and especially Dilthey and his followers, Misch, for instance. And these authors, they were influenced by Goethe. That will be explicitly mentioned in the first chapter, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm guessing, they were also not only familiar, but also influenced by Schelling. So I would guess that there is an indirect influence. So the overall milieu, intellectual milieu in which he was writing and creating was definitely permeated with Schelling's ideas as well. So that's also the reason why, today I kind of try to present some of these authors and just identify some of the ideas that he throws out and why they might be relevant, so that we have an approximate feel for what the heck is it that he's doing, right? And I'll try to do the same for the first chapter. So the two prefaces, the first chapter and the second chapter, are basically chapters where he kind of lays the ground before actually goes and develop his own ideas. So that's the reason why I also kind of want us to get a bit of an overview of what's happening here, what some of these reference points are, and so on and so forth. But if I'm not mistaken, I think that Schelling doesn't get mentioned in this particular text.
He mentions him on page 325 in relation to comparing whether Schelling could be considered, Schelling, Leibniz, and Hegel could be considered some kind of vitalists. Yeah, but it's not really like a direct confrontation. The power of PDF search.
There you go, Matt. Chris, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just sort of laughing a little bit at my own tendency to find one mention of a philosopher somewhere in a very long text and then sort of weave a counter narrative. I have to think about this more, but I think what's central to the Schelling influence may be Schelling's idea of systematicity, in which philosophy and nature are both unified organic wholes. And that's about as much as I can say without really thinking about it, but this idea of systematicity is also essential to Fichte. So there, I think I would provisionally say that between Schelling, Fichte, and kind of this organized post-Kantian philosophy of nature, that there's probably some more to the influence of Schelling, because Schelling also talks about, is it Schelling who talks about the inherent barbarism of nature, something along those lines, and how philosophy has to overcome it? And that's one of philosophy's central tasks. I think that there's more to this story, I think, but I have to think a bit more to it. But it really comes down to Schelling's notion of systematicity, and yeah.
Well, yeah, definitely. So the Plessner is definitely in that tradition. You'll see that time and time again. So this idea of trying to build an a priori theory, and at certain points it almost sounds a bit strange because it's very Kantian, but also very different, because he really tries to expand the foundations of the Kantian project, so to speak. Yeah, but
yeah, I think the question of how Kantian this project is a very interesting one and an open one, because philosophy after Kant tends to try to overcome the distinctions and problems that Kant introduces, but oftentimes ends up reintroducing them. So, yeah. so this is a real. I think this is a real quandary of there's one of the things that I object to in Plessner is this idea that he himself is founding a new inquiry into nature, which unifies philosophical and scientific perspectives, and tries to get beyond these dichotomies. This is everyone has been doing this since Descartes. Descartes, or certainly Kant, can be seen as doing much the same thing. So it's a lot of philosophy is very Freudian, and then you immediately have to try to kill all of your teachers. So I think that's also something to keep in mind too, is I'm very suspicious of this preface, in which it really argues right in quite strident terms for its novelty. I think it's much easier and much better, as we've been doing, to put it in a very firm tradition. And that's all I'll say, because I have two other questions. But
maybe a follow-up to that could be the question of, to what extent is Plessner here committed to some sort of naturalism? I mean, I know that we're talking about the Kantian influence, but it seems to me from reading the preface, especially the second one, that he's constantly going back to the point of, you know, these authors, they have, the big mistake that they made was to, you know, to give precedence to the human, and to sort of divorce existence from the embodied, from life, and that if we want to have a good understanding of human nature, we need to bring in the biology. I mean, there are a lot of nice remarks in the preface where he says, where he's always sort of referring back to the importance of bringing in biological understanding or biological knowledge. So it seems in some sense that in wanting to bring together, or to bring the philosophy into conversation with the biology, that is engaged in some sort of naturalistic project, or would you disagree with that?
I would disagree with that, and he will be very vocal in this regard. No, here's the but what you said then is a really good point. So the one of the main ideas, or one of the main motives behind what Plessner was trying to do, but also, for instance, Scheler and other authors, was precisely to move away from this idealist or transcendentalist turn that happened, for instance, in phenomenology, and that was occurring in the German philosophy at that time. So they thought that, you know, Husserl brought something extremely useful to the table. Kant opened a really, really interesting and promising and venue of research. However, you know, all this implicit idealism, all this implicit subjectivism that was present was problematic. So what he was trying to do, he was trying to develop a theory where you would basically do intuitive philosophy, but that you would not end up in idealism. You would actually still be, so that's if I understood, I haven't read that book yet, but from the fragments that I've you know, been able to read in the levels, in his first book, this is precisely what he's trying to do. He's trying to show in this text, the unity of senses, that the foundation, so the foundational phenomenal, or the phenomenon, or the foundational phenomenal realm is this correlation between the concrete human being and its world. So this correlation is something that you cannot get away from. This idea that you basically can take a further step, as Kant would suggest, or as Husserl would suggest, where you end up in some sort of transcendental subjectivity. This is a step too far, taking a step too far. You cannot get there. You get away from the concreteness or the aliveness of the human person. And this is, if you really want to stick to the, you know, to the phenomenal, to the phenomena, you have to start from there. So you do not lose the world. So this idea that you're kind of cut off from the world and you have to solve this problem somehow, this is a non-problem for Plessner. And he's basically trying to develop a system or a philosophical theory that would have this incorporated at its very core. So at the very.
But why? I still don't understand why you think that this is not a naturalistic project.
because the emphasis is on the intuitive phenomenon. And the problem with naturalism in general is that it starts with mechanisms and processes that are not intuitive, but that lie behind the realm of the concrete phenomena that is given. So the correlation between the world and the human being in its concrete relatedness is something that is, he would say, overlooked by the natural sciences, which operate with very specific within very specific conceptual frameworks. And they would explain, for instance, phenomena in and through causal relationships and mechanisms. And this is not something that is given to you in intuition. So what he's trying to do is the intuitive approach that he's trying to develop is, in a certain sense, a middle way between the causal account of naturalism and the, say, constitutive account of transcendentalism. This is the in-between realm that he's trying to open up.
Okay, maybe it's not immediately apparent to me from just the preface. I haven't read the book, obviously, so I don't know, but from the preface, that's not totally apparent. I mean, what I get from this is almost every page from 23 onwards, remarks about, snide remarks about the overlooking of the biological dimension when thinking about human nature, right? Biological differences mean nothing. He says, 23, he talks about the fact that why we have this disembodied, this separation, which is artificial, between existence and the embodied livingness, and that we need to bring that to bear. And you keep having these remarks. You find them at page 24. That this again, when he talks about the fact that the living world was lost again in existentialism, having been rediscovered by Nietzsche, and along with the embodied human. And I mean, that's what I got.
No, then that's why I said that was a really good point, because the reason why he's spending so much time on making this particular point is because he's constantly arguing the idealist tendencies that he finds in the phenomenological tradition. So this is basically the trying to move away from that. He says, what?
I am just leaving. So thank you for lecture.
Okay, Martin. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Ciao.
See you next time.
Ciao. So he's trying to move away from the idealist extreme and moving towards the, that's why he's emphasizing the embodiment. That's why he's emphasizing the natural and so on and so forth. But in a certain sense, as you will see in next chapters, he will also constantly move away from the opposite end. So from the opposite end of naturalism, of the exact sciences, which according to him also stem from a very specific presupposition. One thing that I would maybe make, and this is also a very useful hint for maybe reading Merleau-Ponty. So authors like Merleau-Ponty and Plessner, they already presuppose that philosophy has somehow transcended naturalism. So that is so the French tradition and the German tradition, they were already at that particular point, they were working in a milieu which somehow was presupposing already that the naivety of naturalism was clearly shown, and it was already superseded. So this is something that you constantly have to bear in mind when reading these authors. For instance, the Anglo-Saxon author would basically, if the Anglo-Saxon author would try to carve a position that would not be strictly naturalistic or idealistic, he or she would devote most of the time debating naturalism, right? Because that's the position that was more firmly entrenched. But they are starting from a different position. For instance, Merleau-Ponty in Phenomenology of Perception, most of his time he's debating intellectualism, way more time than naturalism or realism, because it's how it was kind of presupposed that intellectualism already showed that naturalism is philosophically naive.
I don't see that in this preface. I guess we'll see that.
Yeah. True. Here, here it's still like very.
I mean, all I see is actually a very friendly, remarks towards the sciences, and that maybe the natural sciences can help us. I don't get the feeling that he's saying that they're naive or that there's it's a non-starter. But I gotta have to wait for the next chapter. But that's not. I didn't get that at all. I mean, I actually was kind of cheering him on as he was going on about how. The importance of of not separating existence from life, as he says in page 25, and the importance of encountering biological facts and not having this free-floating idea of existence. So I get what you're saying. I mean, the criticism of this idealistic position is clear, but so far so good for the naturalist, I think.
Yeah, the next chapter will be less cheerful in that regard. Chris, you wanted to say something?
No, I was going to say, well, I suppose I had one general question about how religion, to move us off into another, into maybe a little bit of a different topic. So Scheler is an Augustinian. So, and that's how he thinks of, for example, emotion, love, the importance of feelings. Is there any, I guess, knowing what I know from Plessner's political writings, I mean, where is he like the Protestant Scheler? I mean, is this why their dispute is so is so fierce? I mean, how does how does religious sentiment, feeling, intentionality, how do we explain some of these ideas in this milieu, not to lose it so much?
That's a difficult one. I would say that in general, I don't know, maybe Primož can also add something to this, but in this particular book, he, as you know, he doesn't really kind of go in that direction. I think that what for him is important when he talks about Scheler and the cognitive importance of emotions or affect, is precisely this this broadening of the notion of mind, of mindedness, of human mindedness, and whether this has any particular religious connotations down the line is not clear from this particular book. The way he uses Scheler here is simply in the sense of, look, Scheler kind of brought this to the table. Heidegger did something similar, and as we will see, this will be very important for his understanding of, say, positionality and whatnot. But I would guess, and I think that if I remember correctly, Chris, you read the other book, the political one, right?
Yes.
I don't know. Are there any interesting links with what you've just asked, and what Plessner is doing here? Any that you could think of?
Well, yes, because I think.
Which book are we talking about?
What's it called?
His political, basically, Plessner's political theology, and how that relates to also Scheler's political theology.
Is that the limits of community, or he also has a political anthropology? I think it's Macht und something, which I think came after. Right. And in the political anthropology, he is actually trying to develop a political philosophy derived from this philosophical anthropology developed in the levels, in a way. No, that's not that direct. I just started it, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say generally, without really going in on another path, one of the reasons that that Plessner that rejects Marxism and Bloch so soundly is because he considers Marxism, or kind of this left, either neither right nor left. He embraces this neither right nor left ideology. Is that for Plessner and for Scheler to a certain extent, which is I think why they have such a disagreement, is that philosophical inquiry and political philosophy have to satisfy two conditions. The first condition is that they have to be essentially holistic. So they have to essentially embrace, so biology is politics and politics is biology. And even though Scheler and Plessner are, in a certain sense, both, I think Plessner had less, marriages than Scheler, but I think they are very much interested in providing man an ethical code, some kind of ethical code which enables him to function in a modernity which they believe mankind to be biologically somewhat maladapted to, which is the other side of Gehlen's account of deficient being that both authors, I believe both authors, do pick up on. Essentially you have political philosophy and biology itself have to maintain the sufficient conditions, and this is the other part, that actually tie you to any kind of religious experience. So, and I think religion and politics are very close in these writings because they're essentially seen as the same thing. Or sort of aspects of the same thing. So Protestantism at this time is viewed essentially as a force which moves history along according to a development of its own internal ethical principles. And this is manifested, sort of the spirit of Protestantism manifests itself through history. And Scheler has, I think, the same issue with kind of religious history and religion generally. So philosophy has to be like Spinoza almost, has to have sufficient conditions to explain all manner of things, but it also has to tie mankind hierarchically in a manner which gives them meaning. So both his perceptions and his mind and his body embodiment and his interactions with the social world need to encompass the possibilities of all these relations. And this is why, for both thinkers, mankind is fundamentally different. It's not simply a matter of grades in the chain of being between man and monkey. It's a fundamental break. And that's kind of how I would think about all of these things together. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, for sure. Especially, in light of also the book itself, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. One question I had, or I just want to make sure that this discussion is highlighted a little bit, and this is on page 30 of the PDF, and there can't be a meeting without me quoting something. So, I really like this idea, and I'm a little bit with Dan and also with you about this wonderful discussion about naturalism, because I really like this idea when he talks about man, thanks to his open drive structure, thanks to his language, which in turn is compatible with this structure, the human became emancipated from biologically unambiguous behavior as it exhibited by all animals and acquired biological ambiguity. So I think that's a really nice, lots to unpack in there, lots to think about, but it's also a very nice way of thinking of a number of aspects of Plessner's thought. And also thinking about, there's people we haven't talked about, which I think are very important, like Adolf Portman, who everybody in this meeting knows. But I think that's also something to keep in mind too, is this biological ambiguity, this openness to the world, which allows for growth, not only embodiment, but temporality. I think that's the other part of the critique of Heidegger, is this primordialization of being is something that Plessner thinks as fundamentally problematic, because it's a return in which mankind is on the other hand fundamentally situated in time itself through his intentions and through his interactions with the environment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, Chris.
Not quite fair to Heidegger, by the way, but
no. But I'm really glad you brought this up. The question or the point about biological ambiguity, namely, one of the, and Jan might maybe have an idea about this or a comment on this. One thing that so there are so many interesting parallels between what Plessner is doing and between Merleau-Ponty, for instance. And one of the things that Merleau-Ponty is trying to do is, or that he emphasizes over and over again, especially in phenomenology of perception, is that we need to reclaim the indeterminate as a positive phenomenon. So not as something that is merely a lack, something that is, something that you need to get through in order to get to something that is clare et distincte, so clear and determinate, but that indeterminate plays a constitutive role in also what counts as determinate. And this is the segment that seems to have been lost in the classical accounts of what mind is and what reason is. And people like Scheler, like Gehlen and Plessner, and also Merleau-Ponty were trying to show that there are segments of mindedness that are basically indeterminate or ambiguous, and that this indeterminacy or ambiguity is not a lack, but is something that is constitutive of the mindedness itself, because it allows for openness, it allows for plasticity, it allows for the multiplicity of perspective that I was referring to. So you have a certain something that is determinate, but this is given against the ground of the indeterminacy, and this indeterminacy determines the determinate, so to speak, or is constitutive of determinate. And you cannot get to the point where you would explicate all the implicit segments. Yeah, because as soon as you start doing that, in order to explicate a certain implicate something, you have another implicit background in order that allows you to explain this. So this is a marvelous point, and I'm showing this because I have it on the other screen. So I don't know, Jan, maybe do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a good point about this indeterminacy as a positive phenomenon. That's amazing. That's something I like very much on Merleau-Ponty. But then again, you can say, well, he has the opposite problem, how to make things determinate. So how to account for things like rationality and truth and language. He will say that language signifies as gesture, and that's quite too much of indeterminacy then. So he's starting with the indeterminacy, and he's struggling to get back to rationality and those traditional Cartesian intellectualist topics. But yeah, I think it's a good connection to see the analogy between Merleau-Ponty and his love for openness and this world openness we can see here in Plessner. I think that it's a good way how to think about that, to connect the two.
Actually, Jan, it was through reading Plessner that I actually was able to, I think, that reading Plessner allowed me to get a better understanding of what Merleau-Ponty was trying to do in certain segments. And the talk that I had at the seminar or symposium that you organized, this transformativist account and whatnot, this is precisely like a synthesis of Merleau-Ponty and Plessner and this idea. And I'm not going to go into this. I would just like to very briefly mention that at a certain point, language is precisely the phenomenon where you have this qualitative break again. So it is basically, it is a gesture for sure, but a gesture that at a certain level of complexification, is kind of sublated into a new phenomenon, which is language, which allows for this systematic multi-perspectivity, which is only rudimentary there in the gestural communication. But anyway, Laura raised her hand, so
yeah, so what you said about the segments of mindedness involved indetermination, it sounded like for me like very strong, like for Bergson. And I was wondering, like in the preface, like he doesn't mention Bergson, and on the first chapter he refers to him, like what the influence of Henry Bergson to Plessner was. Besides that, Plessner was, I think, like critical of him, wasn't he? Like his idea of vitalism. But still, like I think this point is like a very interesting link, actually.
Do we have any Bergson experts in the room?
I was going to say, Sebastian, this is more you than me. I mean,
yeah. Okay. So I think that as we will see in the first section, and maybe Yiji also has something to say here. I don't know. Maybe. Okay. No. Everybody's like, no, Bergson. Wait. So it turns out that both Plessner and Merleau-Ponty have a similar issue with Bergson, that this notion of intuition for them is something that goes too far in the direction that it loses the element of reflection, which for them is crucial. So what they're trying to do is, and this will be seen in the first section, is the move towards the, let's say, the autonomous nature of vitality or life is an important one. But if you end up saying that what characterizes life is blind intuition, which is somehow on the opposite spectrum of reflection in general, or any type of conceptuality, you basically end up with a very unproductive and erroneous dualism that needs to be superseded. So the idea for them, as you will see, is precisely they will try to kind of find a way to make reflection, the notion of reflection, broader, and that will somehow be anchored in this element of the vitality, of the pre-reflective, of the indeterminate.
I think like at least like Bergson's meta memory, I think that the reading is not too faithful to say that he's like just like a blind intuitive thinker.
Maybe
but
so,
yeah,
but for instance, in certain, what's the tiny book, the Introduction to Phenomenology, to Philosophy, what's it called again? Like a very tiny. It's a well-known work, probably because it's so short. But there he has this very, very clear split between what he calls conceptuality and intuition. And there's just, conceptuality is always secondary, intuition is always primary. It always breaks through conceptuality. It is something that cannot be captured by conceptuality. Conceptuality is always like this frozen segment in time, but intuition is temporal, dynamic, self-transcending, elusive. So this is what they were reacting against.
Okay.
Okay, so Chris, Dan, maybe you guys have a...
Yeah, I just have two quick questions about, just to make sure that we, in my sense of this text, that we kind of address two fundamental questions. So Plessner does not think that the classical problem of the thing in itself and of man's inability to access it is a problem. He dismisses that problem, and that is by dismissing that problem, he really firmly moves away from Kant and Kantianism. Okay, and the second thing is he also really tries to subvert the I suspect scholastic distinction, because it's an Aquinas, so fine, of mind and body being two separate substances, body being homogeneous, mind being heterogeneous, with two different, basically, teleologies, or sort of ways of being in time and space. And I think that's something that's incredibly important, because he's dismissing these two fundamental problems in philosophy by articulating his modal theory, which is a little bit like a monadology of these monads, these modal theories of biology. Is that all correct? Is that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
And I think that the thing is that he actually starts from this. So because these two points that you mentioned were, I think, if I was able to get the gist or the aim, main aim of the first book that he refers to, was precisely this. So trying to supersede the Kantian problem by establishing these laws of correlation between the concrete human being and the world, and at the same time showing that these different segments of the human, so from senses up till the understanding, that they interweave, that they interpenetrate, that there is no distinction between, say, the spiritual and the life body segment. So, but the thing is that he already thinks that this has been established. So he has already established this from one point, and now he's approaching a problem from a slightly different point, which will have a slightly different emphasis. But it's good that you mentioned this, because philosophically he kind of already thinks that this has been somehow shown.
Right, and the point that you make about sort of the senses and the intellect and the intermixing between all of them is also because that also subverts a very, very key scholastic discussion as well, which goes back and forth for about 500 years.
Yeah.
What to do with what faculty? I mean, that's right.
The thing is that although he starts with this idea of, I don't know, subverting this distinction, in the end, when he's talking about the human, he ultimately concludes that the human is torn into these two things. On the one hand, the lived body, on the one hand, the physical body. This dual aspectivity of mind and body, although he sort of methodologically thinks it's not like a real thing, it is ultimately what the human is fated to have to believe, in a way. It's kind of the fate of the human to be torn in this way. And this, I think, is kind of a bit of a conflict between what he's saying he's doing, but what he ultimately says, yeah, sort of, we've escaped that, but in the end, no, we really haven't. We're still in the same framework, because we are human.
Yeah, but the way he gets to that point is precisely by showing that, you know, he rephrases it in a way where you are eccentric, and therefore you have this problem. You cannot escape it in a certain sense, but you have this different position where you're no longer split in a certain metaphysical sense. That's the main point. The metaphysical split is no longer there. So this eccentricity, you know, it supersedes the positionality of vitality. So you are human in a certain sense, but your nature is such that you're eccentric, and because you do not have center, there's like the lived body that is positioned, but at the same time you're always beyond it. So you're always split. You're kind of destined to be split, but this destined to be split is a unified aspect of your existence in a certain sense. That's the main point. So, you know, in contradistinction, say, to Descartes, where you have, like, you know, spirit and body. Yeah, here you don't have that. You have just one existence, but it is structured in a way where you will always be caught up in duality, so to speak. That's the difference that he's trying to make, you know. So yeah, you're definitely right in the sense that we're kind of destined to this, but not in the, say, Cartesian sense, you know.
Is it an ontological duality, Sebastian, or is it more like a way of explaining epistemically why it is that there seems to be a duality, but there isn't really one?
The way I understand,
you're grounding in a way. You're trying to explain why it is that Descartes got it wrong, right? By suggesting. Yeah. So that again speaks to a broadly naturalistic project, not to, you know, to suggest that maybe we can eliminate these sorts of dualisms and say, well, we can explain why it is that people have been so confused about this. If we think about you know, this idea of eccentric positionality and how you expect certain dualities to emerge, or they seem to emerge as a consequence of, you know, of the nature of human beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, that I think that this will be a very interesting question, and one that I personally also find extremely important. So this question of naturalism. So maybe we can really follow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting.
No, Dan, because this is a really. I'm expected to write a paper in, say, about a year on this debate: naturalism, transcendentalism, and phenomenology and enactivism, and I'm, you know, kind of trying to organize my thoughts on that. So this will be very useful, actually. Okay. So let me just say what I think a potential problem here is, or what somehow the naturalism would have to be able to incorporate for this to be a naturalistic position. Mm-hmm. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to portray or develop a way of looking at the relationship between the human being and its world, say, that is not causal. That's a really important thing. So it's basically trying to, so there is a relationship between the world, nature, and concrete human being, but he's kind of starting from the experience, the intuition, so the intuitive forms that are given in experience, and there you don't really have processes such as causes and causal mechanisms. As soon as you introduce these, according to Plessner, you're moving away from what he is doing. So this might be the reason. So I don't know if naturalism in some way is able to encompass this, then yes, this would be a naturalistic project. But if not, then then
the question is whether you're talking, chronologically speaking, whether one has to begin with intuitions rather than with causes.
Precisely.
Okay? Or if you're really talking about a conflict, and we'll find out if there really is a conflict. I mean,
that's a good point. That's a good point. His point would be that what he's trying to do is develop an a priori theory that you basically, in a certain sense, need for you to be able to actually do any type of natural scientific project. So that's his idea. So and the thing is that as you will see, but it's a very interesting question. He's definitely trying to kind of develop some in-between view or position, and how one would call it, maybe just philosophical anthropology. But you had another question, I guess.
I had another question, yes. It has to do really with the justification for the preface, the second one. I have to say, I wasn't convinced by the explanations that he gave for why he thinks that his book was not taken more seriously. Honestly, I don't think that's such a good idea to ask the person himself, right? Imagine you write, you write a paper and then someone asks you 50 years later, well, why is it that your paper didn't make more of a splash? I mean, are you really the person that's most, the most appropriate person to ask about these things? Maybe it speaks more, it's more revealing about your own sort of, judgments of, whatever, your priorities. I mean, I was, to be honest, really surprised at some of the things that he says at the beginning of especially on page 20. He gives an explanation in terms of 1933, right? You mentioned this in your presentation. He also talks about being in time and other books that came out at a time. But then he also talks about the biology, and that's the part that I feel more suited to comment on. And I'm definitely not convinced by what he says. I was actually really surprised to hear him say what he says. He says, so this is the final paragraph, page 20. So the greatest impediment was the book itself. Again, you quoted this in your talk, in your presentation. Somebody had dared to treat biological subjects in a philosophical manner, as if that was subversive, not realizing that one of the great things about, the German speaking tradition in the first decades of the 20th century is precisely this desire to want to engage with biology in a philosophical manner, right? So I was, very, very surprised, because a lot of the work that I'm doing, looking at this period, is in showing that there was a lot of discussion that was going on about philosophical biology, you could call it, or theoretical biology, right? And here you have a German, right, saying that, basically speaking about the period as if it was some sort of Anglo-English person who doesn't know anything about German. That was my impression. I mean, if I were to ask Michael Roos, why it is that you don't have any engagement, and I would expect him to say something along the lines of what Plessner says here, right? Seriously, it's at that level of disconnect. I mean, so I was thinking why that is, and maybe the reason is that he does talk about professional philosophers, right? He says, the next sentence, in Germany, philosophers, and then he specifies trained philosophers, rarely have a relationship with natural science. Maybe that is already sort of circumventing, right? Saying, well, we're not even going to mention all the biologists who were philosophically inclined, who were actually in Germany and Austria, most of them, or many of them at the very least, right? So that's super weird to me. Then he says, if you do have them, they're usually interested in quantum mechanics and physics, he says, right? Only the theoretical physicists tend to be more interested in. Again, weird thing to say, because some of the German theoretical physicists were interested in the connection between physics and biology. Think of Pascual Jordan, for example. A classic example of a theoretical physicist with philosophical interest in biology. So again, that seemed weird because I'm sure that as a German academic, he would have been aware of this. Then he says, then he is self-deprecating. He says the botanist and the zoologist, the simplest souls, he says, people of intuition, not as sophisticated as physicists, and are not drawn to the hair-splitting of conceptual analysis. What? I mean, again, you have this entire program of Allgemeine Biologie and Theoretische Biologie, you have book series, you have conferences, you have correspondence, you have an entire discourse which is founded on the desire to bring conceptual clarity to biology, because there's this sense that biology is too fragmented. This is at the turn of the 20th century. This is something that you see again and again and again. Biology is super fragmented. We need to bring some sort of unity through theory, through philosophy. And theory and philosophy are often discussed in the same breath. And this happens in Germany. You know, it's a German phenomenon. And so this is, again, really weird to me to see him not, especially given the fact that he was trained as a botanist, as a zoologist, right? Studied zoology. But I mean, the only way I have to explain it, maybe someone else has insight on this, is that he went on to become a professional philosopher and didn't really engage with his own contemporaries in biology. I mean, he mentions Driesch and Erskine. Driesch, by the way, perfect example of a biologist who then actually became a philosopher, had a chair in philosophy at Heidelberg, right? So that's already sort of this, he's already contradicted himself in a sense. His own mentor is someone who was super interested in the philosophical foundations of biology in the way that he says that didn't happen. But I mean, I was sort of curious. I mean, I've had a look at the index to see what authors are mentioned in the text. I have seen a mention of Huxley, Julian Huxley and J.B.S. Haldane, but it's going to be very interesting to me, and I hope I'm not too disappointed to see whether the extent to which he's actually engaging, or at least perhaps mentioning other biologists. I mean, think of, for example, the work of Cassirer, right? In Hamburg, his last book, The Problem of Knowledge, I have it there, where he's got this whole section. The third part of that book is about biology, philosophical biology. And he's engaging there with not only with Erskine and Driesch, but also with Meyer Arbich, with Bertalanffy, with with Schack, so many of these German authors, okay, who were actually interested in developing a philosophical biology. So, I mean, maybe, and he was a philosopher. He was probably much further away from the biology than Cassirer was much further away from the biology than Plessner. So I don't think Plessner really has an excuse if he chooses not to engage with his own contemporaries, people born in the 1890s, you know, coming of age, writing in the 1920s. This is like peak organicism. It's peak. It's a high tide. It's a good time to reflect philosophically on biology, and yet you get him saying in 1965, well, you know, no surprise that my book had no influence because there was no appetite. Not true. And I don't think that maybe an English reader might think that that's the case, but anyone even remotely familiar with what's going on in biology and theoretical biology during the interwar period will know that that's just it's a non-starter to try to justify it that way. So yeah, very surprised. And then he goes on to talk about at the very end of that page, right? He says, "A philosophy of the organic ? The times of Driesch were over." Well, are you trying to tell me that the only way to develop a philosophy of the organic is to become an anachronistic vitalist like Driesch? That's the only way to philosophically think about life? Again, super weird thing to say, very weird thing to say. The question of vitalism had lost its currency, just as the idea of producing living processes in a test tube had lost its terror. That's obviously a reference to the sort of triumph of the mechanistic point of view developed by Loeb and others. And then he talks about biochemistry has long been taken for granted as avenues for the study of genetics and viruses. My question, so what? Are you trying to suggest that biochemistry doesn't bring with it interesting philosophical questions of its own about the nature of cellular order, about the nature of the molecular constituents of life? I don't think that follows that just because biochemistry became important, that there was no longer room for philosophical engagement with biology, just because it became, you know, interested in these issues. And then finally, the big top of the page 21, where there was still room for speculation in phylogeny, even the neo-Darwinists operated with great caution. And then he mentions the centennial celebrations in 1959, right, of Darwin. And again, the sort of thing you would expect an Anglophone scholar who knows nothing about German biology to mention, right? Biology is basically the history of biology, the history of Darwinism. So, you know, to the extent that there's been philosophical engagement, then you should look at it, looking at people who were working in biology. But again, doesn't follow, right? You've got all these German evolutionists, you know, even picked up by people like Marjorie Green, you know, Otto Schittenwolf and all these paleontologists who have these sort of idealistic ideas, who who are also trying to engage philosophically with biology. So anyway, I just wanted to let this out. And then he talks about cybernetics, right? He says cybernetics also meant that we were no longer. What's he talking about? Hans Jonas writes papers criticizing cybernetics. Why this reduction of purpose or to feedback is inappropriate. And Bert Lamphey too, people that he would have been aware of. So why is he saying that these move? It was almost like inevitable, right? He's saying, there was inevitable that my work would be forgotten, overlooked by biologists, because biology was, it just doesn't follow. And I think that it was not convincing. And it makes me wonder, that what is the real reason that this work wasn't taken more seriously, at least on the biological side. I'm not talking about the philosophers, okay? I don't know as much as most of you on that, but on the biological side, it seems like a very bizarre thing to say to justify why his book was not taken more seriously. And I'll end it there, sorry.
Then after first 2 chapters, I think this mystery will be revealed. And no, not with regards to content. I'm not referring to contents. I'm referring to the chapters and how they're written. And I think that there's a lot to be said on that particular point. And he does not touch upon that, the way that he writes.
But doesn't he identify himself as a zoologist? He says, I studied zoology. I mean, the way he starts. For me, what was interesting, he says there's this tension between science and biology. He's constantly bringing the biological dimension, and yet it seems to me, I mean, I'll suspend my judgment until we read the later chapters, that he's not drawing on all the resources that he has available, right? True. At the time in 1928, which are substantial, right? To engage biologically. He's not alone. Right, he's not doing this on his own, and it's even more forgivable in 1965 when he's looking back 40 years later and saying that even in 1965 he has reasons to believe that he was doing this on his own, and that that this is why it wasn't taken more seriously.
You will definitely be disappointed, Dan, with regards to his engagement with biologists. I can promise you that. Unfortunately, I was somewhat disappointed as well, and to be quite honest, it's a mystery to me as well why he does not draw on all these other authors. Chris?
I have a very partial explanation based on a thesis book that I'm working on, which tries to account for a specific idea of the kind of this neo-Kantian account of the organic. And I think that a partial explanation is that people like Otto Liebmann and Bruno Bauch, and Dan, we talked about this before a little bit, are trying to develop a concept of the organic which looks at Kant's mechanistic philosophy and Kant's philosophy of nature and finds really serious problems with it, and then draws on work like for example, Otto Hertwig and others in the same tradition. So I think one of the problem with Plessner's lack of his anxiety and his lack of engagement with these authors has to do with with basically his hostility to doing the work of philosophical biology from a philosophical perspective that he rejects. And I think that's very clear, because there is a very significant movement of, if neo-Kantianism means anything, and that's a different discussion at this time, that there is a neo-Kantian movement in the philosophy of biology and the account of the organism, but Plessner and that a number of biologists, zoologists, physiologists in Germany and France that are very intent on thinking about biology and physiology and genetics philosophically, but because of their presuppositions are different from Plessner's, I think Plessner really kind of violently rejects any of these investigations. And you can see this with Driesch, for example. I maintain that he's very, in some ways, unfair to Driesch, that there's much more to Driesch than Plessner accounts for, and that, in general, we have to bring Driesch back into kind of philosophical thinking about biology during the period as part of this wider narrative that I'm constructing. That's a very partial answer, and like Sebastian, I also am a little bit it is a bit of an unknown, but from my perspective, that's one partial explanation that I have. And also the neo-Kantians were quite nasty. So Bruno Bauch is not someone who takes disagreement all that lightly. And at this time, you know, these disputes where basically very small distinctions are matters of life and death that occur, that are then taken even after someone dies. They're continued. So this is these discussions get very, I mean, someone really needs to do a study of 19th and early 20th century scientific polemics, because it really is a different sort of argumentation where even the most granular distinctions, and say for someone like Kuno Fischer, become it's the difference between an appointment in Berlin or not, with many of these figures. So a lot of this is the tensions are much higher than they are now in most philosophical disputes too. There's a social aspect to this.
That's a good point, yeah. Any other reflections on this?
He does mention quite a few obscure German biologists from the period. He does go into that. Like, even if you look at the index, there's plenty of these weird names. If you Google them up, you find some kind of Deutsche Zoologe or something like that. So I wouldn't say he was completely ignorant, but in a way he does analyze why he might have been out of touch himself. He says that as he was working, there seemed to have been little of this contact between the different disciplines. So I guess in the environment in which he was working, he did actually have some kind of a limited contact with other academic disciplines, such as I suppose theoretical biology. And he was in the end he did gravitate towards philosophy. So he lost touch with that previous work, and I think that might have figured into it as well.
Yeah, I mean, surely though we need to distinguish between him being at fault for that, or if it's the case that there was no appetite. My take on what he said was that he couldn't have, that's nothing to do with him, almost like it's maybe I misread, but that it was like, yeah, there was,
yeah, that it was a state thing.
That's vitalism. I mean, yeah. Well, no, it wasn't, and that's a really shit excuse. So no, I mean, it makes sense what you're saying, right? So yes, he might have chosen not to, or wasn't able to engage with these people, but even the institutional infrastructure was there for that communication to happen. And you know, I've been looking at that a little bit. There's you know, these you know, book series that are basically organized so to bring a community together in Germany and Austria, so that you have people who can reflect and discuss each other's views on the need for conceptual clarification in biology, because there's a shared sense of fragmentation. So that's in the air, you know, and that's why I was a bit surprised to see him.
Yeah.
From this way, it was.
I mean, from my perspective, everyone is talking about biology at this period of time. I mean, for Reinhard Kroner, for God's sake, I mean, this is not a name anyone knows, but he becomes a relatively well-known post-war Protestant theologian, and even he writes a book on the philosophy of biology. So the idea that it's always somebody's second book to write something on the kind of the philosophy of nature or the history of biology or some kind of topic, because this was in the air. So it's strange, and probably, you know, Bloom talks about the anxiety of influence. So it's simply, I mean, one of the things that a historian would say is, you know, are there any of Plessner's private papers available, and what did he really think about these people? Mm-hmm. You know, sort of Gehlen has an estate. I know that, so does Blumenberg. So we have a good sense of what they thought in private, but I'm not positive off the top of my head. Where are Plessner's papers? Did they survive? You know, have they survived or not?
Yeah, but that's a very interesting question, though. I mean, this lack of engagement with certain other thinkers, and what you said, Chris, that's a good point. I mean, during those times, you had a very interesting academic milieu or atmosphere where basically you would have people. Okay, Iji, be well. So, where the same authors would be able to write books on political theology and on basically philosophical biology. So it was just a very interesting period of time. You know, the same people talking about the nature of organism and about the difference between Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, and it's
and that's almost
yeah,
the same book in Tonnes's case. I mean, that's
so yeah, I don't know. You know, if I'm kind of trying to construct some sort of let's say, you know, how do they put it? Whenever you're trying to reconstruct someone's position, try to take as a benevolent approach as possible.
Charitable,
yeah, charitable. Yeah. So okay, so my attempt at the charitable approach would be as follows. So he publishes the book in 1928, right? So maybe at that particular point, or 26, it's written already in 26. So maybe at that particular point, his approach, as Primož said, is somewhat limited to these other sources or resources. He doesn't have enough opportunity to study them. So 5 years after, so what happens then? He publishes a book in a really crappy time, during a really crappy time. So 1 year before Heidegger publishes his book, and basically phenomenology explodes with Heidegger. The same year he publishes his book, Scheler publishes his book, who's like, and he's a, you know, an extremely important, influential author, and he covers a very similar ground. That's the point that he does. So, you know, like these two monumental figures publish their books, and there's little Plessner publishing his densely written treatise.
No, I buy that. It's just that he also gives the biological explanation, and that's the one I don't buy, because that's the one I know a little better. Well, and I'm not saying that he overlooks it. I haven't read the text, so maybe he does engage. Okay, I just from the preface.
No,
what I'm saying is that
he does, but not to the degree that you will be.
Well, I mean, if you're trained in zoology and your whole deal is that you're going to bring the biological into conversation. I mean, you would expect, right?
Agreed. Okay. Yeah. So
I'm just thinking we can say, or at least from my perspective, we can say very similar things about Heidegger, the way how he treats Heidegger. I think this is quite ridiculous what he says about Heidegger, missing question of embodiment or life. Heidegger would have much more to say, I imagine, how to defend himself. I was thinking like, well, this is a bit superficial what he's presenting. Like, it's not that simple in Heidegger, because Heidegger also speaks about life and even embodiment on some occasions, and we can still say, okay, he misses that in kind of in favor of existence, but there would be much more to say. So I think we can even pour more gas in the fire from the philosophy side.
I would just say, Jan, that's a very good point. So two things. One thing, I don't know if you got the same impression, but when he talks about Heidegger, I always have the impression that he's really, really badly butthurt that Heidegger simply did not engage with his ideas, because he explicitly says, like, there was this room and opportunity for engagement, but he chose to overlook this. And I had this as a quote in my, but I threw it out because it was too long, so it was just like, you had the opportunity. I was giving you the possibility of grounding your existential analysis, but you didn't do it. But however, this is the second point. He, as you've noticed, he draws on Löwit's critique of Heidegger. So he's being somewhat clever, I think, because he's not doing it directly, but he's using another author, a very important German thinker, showing these, deficiencies. And Löwit himself, he was one of Heidegger's students. So it gives even more credence to what he's saying. So he's butthurt, but he's doing it so his critique is very intelligent, because he's utilizing Löwit's critique to make a point that he's also personally, basically angry about.
Still, I would call it a not good enough literature review.
Yeah, for sure. That would be the reviewer's comment, the second reviewer. Consider
rejected.
Consider including 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I mean, historians are for a long time. I mean, I'm not really a historian, so I don't really like to agree with them. As far, whenever I can, I try to avoid agreeing with historians because they tend to not like, for example, treatments of an account, autobiographical treatments, like they're the worst, right? We can't rely. If you want to know about what happened, don't ask the person who did it, because the scientist is going to, in the history of science is very common, is going to tell the story in a way that you can't trust. So yeah, it's just maybe a point about not necessarily, you know, believing as it's been shown, like in the discussion, the actual reasons why his work wasn't taken more seriously, because he's
bad writer.
No, that's a good point. You know, that's precisely that's one of the things that I'm hoping that we would, you know, achieve with these meetings. So we have, like, we present what Plessner has to say, and then we go at it from different perspectives, trying to reconstruct his ideas, see the flaws. And that's a very good point. You know, it's one thing to reconstruct what Plessner is saying, and then another whether, you know, you kind of agree with that or not. And I would agree. I have to admit, I wasn't really paying as much attention to this particular segment, so to the biological side. So I really appreciate that you brought this up. But
that's why I'm here.
But I had the same issue, or the same problem with the Heideggerian thing.
Right.
This is where I had the impression that he was most Botthor, to be quite honest, because he's kind of being very explicit or clear about this, you know, that there's no embodiment, no corporeality, and here, you know, you have like this nice little account that is grounded in vitality. You could have taken it, but you chose to ignore it. Martin, why? Why did you do that?
I just had one more idea. Could it be that he was reading the situation of the year he was writing the preface in back into the year when he published the book? Like, with time towards the second part of the 20th century, empirical science might have gained an upper hand in certain sectors of the academic sphere. So then it might have been the case that philosophy had divorced itself from biology. Yeah. And then he was sort of retrospectively, anachronistically, just kind of trying to explain his failure in that manner.
Yeah, a better case for sure can be made for that. You know, that there was less engagement later on, right? 40s, 50s, although, you know, one can dispute even that. But you know, maybe that's, yeah, I think you might be right. Maybe this is a way of explaining that if he's not talking about reception in 1928, but rather writing in 1965 why it is that, you know. But again, not totally convincing, and especially because you got in the German-speaking community people who are engaging with biochemistry, with cybernetics, and, you know, sometimes philosophers, not even biologists, right? And what I don't like about it is that it perpetuates this myth that there was no interesting engagement between philosophy and biology. If you read this, right, and you don't know anything else, it's a way of reassuring yourself that there's nothing for you to read because there was nothing there. Right, and that's just, and I'm surprised to see a German speaking author making that claim. That's
yeah, and the level of engagement is still, you know, as we will see, except for there are a few exceptions where he really does engage with, for instance, certain ideas or certain studies. But in general, yeah, the level of engagement is surprisingly slim.
It's a little better in the appendix. He does mention some more current studies of how life originated and so forth. Cool. Yeah, like in the study itself, in the book itself, I guess he is also kind of trying to avoid contaminating himself with too much direct involvement with the biological community, because he is, in a certain sense, also trying to give his original take, which is prior to biology in a certain sense.
Right. I actually have to go as well.
Yeah. I think this is a good place to wrap this up. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you. This was a really good discussion. So thanks to all of you, and thanks Dan for, you know, pressing this issue.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that next time the next meeting is in 2 weeks, right, or something like that. Anyway, I'll send you an email, a reminder, so you don't have to worry about that. Have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Take care.